Okay, we're going to talk about designing protected areas. This is important when we talk about conservation of ecosystems and looking at the ecosystem-based approach to conservation. We have to look at the size, the distribution of the habitats, and those kinds of things. So we're going to talk about what is important for including in our design of our protected areas. First of all, we want to keep in mind SLOS, which is single large or several small. So ideally, just like when we talked about the island biogeography, we would prefer a larger piece of area to preserve versus smaller pieces of areas. But obviously, if we have to have smaller, we can have several of them, and then there's some things that we want to keep in mind in terms of if we have those smaller ones, what do we do to make sure that organisms can move between those different habitats. So bigger is definitely, a single large one is definitely better, but we can also have several small, as this diagram shows you. So when we talked about this with the island biogeography, but habitat fragmentation occurs when we create these habitat islands where we've built roads or we've broken up these large pieces of habitats to where organisms can't cross over into the different areas, or it makes it more difficult. So it isolates those groups and makes them more vulnerable to predation, competition, disease, and catastrophic events. You also decrease the gene pool in those areas. So we want to minimize the habitat fragmentation as much as possible. We also want to take into consideration edge effects. Ecotones are what happens along the edges of different habitats. So it's basically where you have an overlap of different ecosystems. And usually in those overlap areas, you have a higher biodiversity. You also have increased predation and competition because of those overlapping ecosystems. So we want to minimize that so that we can preserve the integrity of that protected area. So rather than having square shapes, we would like to have round shapes or rather than long and thin shapes, because if we think about surface area, the more edges that we have in that protected area, the more of these ecotones we're going to have, and we want to minimize that so that we can keep that one ecosystem intact and decrease that competition to allow for the species to survive. We also want to create corridors. So let's say we have to have several small habitats that we preserve. We want to have connections to those so that organisms can move from place to place. And this is also important in urban areas, but these corridors are strips of protected land that link the different reserves. So it allows for individuals to move from place to place, which allows the gene pool to increase, which allows for increased biodiversity, and also for seasonal migration. So if we have to have these smaller pieces of protected areas, we want to make sure that they are linked so that we have that movement of the genes in the different species. We also want to create these buffer zones. So these are zones around a core reserve. So if we have this large area that we're preserving, we want to have a buffer zone, which is like a transitional area that keeps the majority of humans out so that we're not disturbing it. We want to keep it as undisturbed as possible for the sensitive species, but that buffer zone could also be used for natural resource extraction, experimental research, and things like that. So it's minimal impact, but it's protecting that area that is undisturbed for the sensitive species. So buffer zones allow for protection of those endangered or sensitive species. Here's an example of what it looks like, and this is from your textbook. So you have your core area in the middle that's undisturbed. It's natural. It allows for the ecosystem to thrive. And then you have the buffer zone around it that is really just for research or maybe some natural resource extraction. So you don't have as many people coming into that area, and it protects that center or core area. And then you have another buffer zone outside of that, allows for more human interaction. So, but this might be something where you have tourism, or you might have hiking trails or things like that, that brings income to help pay for this protected area. So these buffer zones allow to protect that center area. So this brings us to, we've talked about habitat fragmentation, and this happens a lot in urban areas. So what do we do about protecting the biodiversity in urban areas? We want to have as much green space as possible. Green space is can be a park, it can be a green roof, it can be lots of different things. We want to minimize gray space, which is going to be like parking lots and things like that. Brownfield sites are areas where you have abandoned housing, or you have abandoned warehouses or things like that, or an abandoned parking lot, and you bring that area back to where we use it for some kind of habitat, adding the producers, so that allows for birds to come in and things like that. But it does it in a aesthetically pleasing way. We can have private gardens and balconies, so again, that's kind of a green roof idea. Having community gardens, even in urban areas. We're not really considered an urban area, but if you think about the downtown area, you can still have like a community garden on balconies or on the roof and things like that. All of that allows for some biodiversity. It's obviously not the best choice, but it's a way to compromise to get biodiversity. So when we design a green space for biodiversity, we have to think about the size of it. Obviously bigger is better, but if you can't have the big spaces, you can have smaller ones that are connected, and a variety of different types of habitats as well, and making sure that we have native species, especially when we're talking about our community or any other community. We want to focus on those native species that are here. If we use non-native species, one, you have to use more water, or you have to have special circumstances, bring them in during the winter, that kind of thing. Whereas when you have native species, you don't have any special things that you have to do for it. It also attracts the native birds and other organisms. So you always want to start with those native species so that you're providing for the organisms that would be here naturally. So just something to think about. The North Lake development, which we know has already started, we're going to be looking at these pictures in class, specifically the one on the right, which is a picture of North Lake in 2007. This is down Denton Tap Beltline, where Lee Elementary is located, and the picture on the left is the artist drawing of that development. It's already started, it's not completed yet, but there is a space on here for Lee Elementary. So just something to think about is, as you look at this, how did they design the community for green space, and how would you change maybe the things that they did? Did they create, obviously we have a habitat fragmentation, so did they create green spaces that were connected? Did they allow for native species and things like that? So those are just questions to think about as it applies to our community. And so to wrap up with designing protected areas, not only do we want to focus on the organisms and the ecosystem itself, obviously as humans, when we're talking about areas where we're living, we also have to keep in mind the economics of that as well. So it's always important to think of, we can set this land aside, but what is the cost-benefit analysis of preserving this particular area just to be natural as it is, and then how can we compromise with that to help maintain that area and look at it economically as well.